Welcome back to another one of your flip lectures. Today we're going to talk about the war at home, the United States during the First World War, as well as propaganda. And as you may remember, the United States entered the war in 1917 after the sinking of the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram caused the U.S. to join the Allied powers. And so in the war in 1917, here are the sides. Allied powers include Great Britain, France, Russia, and now the United States. The Central Powers consist of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. But as we remember, the war in 1917 is in a state of stalemate. And so essentially, if we take a look at the map at this point, on November 30th of 1917, the battle lines have been drawn across all of France, down in the Balkans near Turkey, as well as on the Eastern Front between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. But essentially, these battle lines had moved very, very little. And even though there had been 3 years of fighting, not much had been gained by either side. But when the United States comes into the war, they don't really have a firm reason to join. And so President Woodrow Wilson decides to change the meaning of the United States' involvement in World War I by saying now that the conflict was not just about the Lusitania or the Zimmerman telegram, but he says America is fighting to make the world safe for democracy. And Wilson's speech, in which he pledged the United States was going to war to make the world safe for democracy, came up with 14 points, which were essentially the goals for the United States that they were hoping to get out of the First World War. They were probably overly idealistic. He called them principles for world peace. And so if we talk about Abraham Lincoln changing the meaning of the Civil War by making it about slavery, Woodrow Wilson, to a certain extent, is trying to change the cause of the United States' involvement in World War I. Remember, this is a European war. The United States really doesn't have all that much to gain by fighting in it. And so these are Wilson's 14 points. They involve things like no more secret negotiations, the freedom of the seas, free trades, as well as this idea of self-determination of peoples, that all of the ethnic groups that were living within empires should be able to, at the end of the war, determine for themselves if they want to stay in these empires or create their own independent states. And the last sticking point of the 14 points that's really important is the creation of a League of Nations, which would basically be an association of the powerful countries of the world to try to guarantee the political independence of all states. Now, the League of Nations as an idea is going to ultimately fail, but the United Nations of today is a direct descendant of Wilson's original idea of the League of Nations. So when the United States enters the war, they need to mobilize. They need to get the country ready to fight in this global conflict. And so President Wilson and Congress create the War Industries Board, which essentially organizes industry in order for them to begin making weapons and equipment for war as opposed to the consumer products that they had been making before. In order to fill the army, the selective service, the draft, is called up. And this army is going to be really diverse with all of kind of a lot of the different ethnic groups, first, second generation immigrants. However, black soldiers are still going to be in segregated units in the First World War. But ultimately, when we talk about these different European ethnicities kind of becoming American, or Americanized rather, this is really the moment in which that happens. Then on the home front, food, fuel, rubber, other important war materials are going to be rationed, where you would actually get a book of coupons and you were only allowed to buy a certain amount of these kind of very important products that could be used in war production. Also, in order to pay for the war, Americans were encouraged to buy victory and liberty bonds, and they end up buying about $20 billion worth of these throughout the course of the war. Remember, bonds are a government IOU, and so the citizens were encouraged to buy bonds from the government to pay for the war now to be paid back later. And also the mobilization of the U.S. workforce is going to cause a lot of changes in the American society. Women are going to go to work in larger numbers than ever before. African Americans in the South are going to migrate to northern cities in order to take advantage of the wartime jobs. And about 100,000 plus workers from Mexico are allowed to come into the United States legally in order to work during the wartime. And so ordinary Americans find themselves in the Army, training, enjoying the company of their fellows, and this is where we see some of those ethnic tensions between the groups like the Italians, the Irish, the Germans, the Polish begin to kind of melt away. Service in a war together is going to break down a lot of the cultural and kind of ethnic barriers between these new groups of Americans. Also, women are going to go to work in a major way and going to take on a large role in American society, which we can talk about as influencing the women's liberation movement in the 1920s. Also, in order to fill America's demand for agricultural workers, women were encouraged to join up with something called the Women's Land Army to take over farms from men or other people who had gone off to fight in the war. And so the farmerettes were called up in order to kind of make sure that the United States' agricultural production was kept up even during the demands of wartime. And so a national campaign portraying, perhaps for among the first times, kind of strong, independent women, is going to call thousands of women into service in the Women's Land Army. But as you can see, kind of the images about women are going to start to shift during this First World War. But inside the United States, there's also a lot of fear and paranoia associated with the war. There was this idea that there was kind of like saboteurs and kind of spies and agents of the enemies everywhere. And so, in 1918, a Sedition Act was passed. And the Sedition Act made it illegal for anyone to publicly criticize the war. And as you can see from the political cartoon, this was a very, very controversial law, because essentially what it did was curtail, limit Americans' freedom of speech. There's also a lot of anti-German sentiment, so much so that the food sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage in a lot of American cafes, as well as hamburger was renamed Salisbury Steak as to sound more American and less German. And also there was a fear of espionage. Americans were encouraged to be watchful for any enemy spies or activities, and so all of this is going to lead to a lot of fear in the United States. And in order to help out with kind of people's paranoia and fear, the United States created the Committee on Public Information, which was charged with making official kind of posters, films, and other things that we now would refer to as propaganda. And propaganda is a form of communication that really is about influencing the attitudes of people towards a particular kind of position on it. It's not based on facts necessarily. Usually propaganda is based on emotional response and bias-style statements to appeal to people's emotions rather than their intellect. And so in Europe, propaganda is going to take a couple of forms. If we kind of take a look at these photos, let's see if we can figure out what type of tactics are being used to try to convince people to fight in this war. In Germany, you can see the propaganda is a little bit different than the propaganda that will be used in Great Britain. And so it's kind of interesting to look at kind of the depiction of kind of the German family, the German soldier, versus kind of the way that the British are going to try to convince their peer persons to join up in the war effort. In the United States, I want you for the U.S. Army, perhaps the most iconic of all of the American propaganda posters, is going to be used for the first time, encouraging Americans to join up in the war efforts. The ideas of American exceptionalism as well are going to be very ever-present in American propaganda. Comparing General Blackjack Pershing and the American Army as crusaders, fighting for good, fighting for this cause, and it's an interesting use of propaganda. Also, beyond just propaganda posters, there was also music. Songs written like Over There, songs written like Hunting the Hun, encouraged Americans via song to join up with the war effort. So if we take a look at propaganda, a lot of this as well deals with the idea of fear. You have to a certain extent these kind of like different types of propaganda posters. There's the shame, There's kind of just like the overarching kind of big image that's supposed to convince you. There's song. There's also this idea of like fear, portraying the enemy as somehow subhuman, all of those things. There's also this idea of like shame, used very, very much in these posters. Which side of the window are you? Asking you, are you going to sit out while the rest of your country goes to war? Americans were also encouraged to eat less bread, and so propaganda posters, kind of interestingly enough, trying to encourage Americans to change the way they ate to support the war effort. Also encouraging Americans to buy bonds, and so if we take a look at these pictures, this propaganda, analyzing these is very interesting to see how is it trying to appeal to your emotions to get you involved in the war effort. And so the United States, for 2 years, is going to spend about $27 billion on the war. In today's money, that's closer to $493 billion. But ultimately, the United States' experience on the home front is going to change a lot of things in the country that are going to become more and more apparent in the 1920s. As well as for the war itself, America's industry and manpower is going to tip the scales of stalemate in favor of the Allies. And so by the end of this war, the United States is going to go through some immense changes. Women are going to enter the workforce, minorities are going to move to northern cities, Americans are going to be asked to set aside everything to fight for the war effort, but ultimately the United States' involvement will result in a victory for the Allies.